Hello, darling. There are people who worry that love isn't real because it is simply a series of chemical reactions in the brain. And then there are people who know that love is real because they experience it. Which type are you? Are you the type to even be bothered by such questions? Do you think our ephemeral human experiences lose something if we can break them down into their cold mechanical parts? This is the theme of tonight's story. Please join me now as we explore I Sing the Body Mechanic. I never knew my real father, and the man who stepped into that role when I was a baby did a poor job of it. It was therefore no surprise when I attached myself so completely to my tutor, Fortescue, who was everything I aspired to be. He was educated, erudite, charming, but restrained. He was never a cad, and never used his superior wit to shame or belittle others. I first met him when I was 9. By the time I was 12, I was practically living with him, though he bade me return to my mother's house each night. Fortescue lacked my family's wealth, but more than made up for it in generosity of time and patience. He seemed an old man to me when I was a child, and so it was that he almost became younger as I grew up. He took me to the great World's Industrial Exhibition in Paris in 1844. I was 20, and surprisingly to me, Fortescue was only 40. We had become friends, and something akin to father and son, but he was still very much my teacher. He took me to each of the exhibits, explaining their workings and remarking on how they might or might not change the future. It was here that we saw some of the earliest photography, the first automated device for calculating arithmetic, and the first sax horn, among other wonders. What Fortescue had hoped beyond hope to show me was the legendary mechanical Turk, the yet inexplicable clockwork wonder that played chess without human assistance and had beaten many grandmasters. Fortescue had seen it twice during the travels of his youth, and was entirely convinced that it was a real working device, and not just some parlor trick. I withheld judgment, for while I'd seen some wonders myself in my short life, I failed to see how a clockwork could recognize objects or make decisions. Fortescue insisted that the mechanical Turk did neither, that this was the power of illusion. In reality, the machine was simply reacting to the placement of the variously weighted pieces upon the board, with different combinations automatically resulting in predetermined actions, punched into a card like a player piano. It was the fact that some unknown engineer had constructed this system so beautifully and completely that was the miracle. I remained unconvinced. Alas, the mechanical Turk did not appear at the Paris exhibition, but on the outskirts of the fair was a small pavilion, closed and deserted, advertising an upcoming preview of new automata unlike anything seen since the Turk's 1770 debut. Fortescue excitedly drew a pencil from his pocket and wrote down the time given, saying he would not miss it for the world. For my part, I felt only a mild curiosity, but it pleased me to see my teacher so animated, so I agreed we would go. We returned late that night, when most of the attractions that drew crowds by day were shut up until morning, and the seedier side of the fair was on full display. It was both alarming and exciting to walk amongst this different set. Aristocratic men, their faces covered by tall hats and high collars, slinked into tents where strange devices were sold, things which promised to excite the carnal natures of their wives who had lost interest in such matters. Even lonelier sorts inquired about bizarre assistive machines which claimed to aid in pleasure-seeking, though to Fortescue and I these devices looked more like instruments of torture. People amused themselves with pornographic zoetropes. Absinthe flowed, opium smoke and distorted calliope music filled the air. The small pavilion stood quiet, but warm light poured from within. The sign advertising the event was now gone, so there was no indication of what awaited inside. Instead, there was a new sign, upon which was painted a single word, or a name perhaps, Machinacea. We entered the pavilion, finding a small but elegant soirée in progress, with perhaps 30 attendees. It was mostly men, a few women, all people who looked like my mother's sort, aristocratic, wealthy, curious about all things new and unusual. The floor was covered in Persian rugs, the walls with heavy curtains and ropes. It gave an overall impression of a sheikh's tent or similar. A woman dressed like a Roma fortune-teller, her features obscured by heavy and theatrical makeup, approached us and said, in a thick Carpathian accent, "Welcome, gentlemen, to the Machinacea. We hope you enjoy the exhibit." Looking about the room, Fortescue said, "But where is the attraction, madam?" The woman smiled and said, "The fact that you must ask is a high compliment to the master's craftsmanship. But there." She pointed across the way, her pale arm covered in bangles and rings. There was an almost gazebo-like enclosure toward the back of the pavilion, separated from the main area by wicker screens and lighter, semi-sheer draperies. Two figures, a beautiful young man and woman in the most splendid fashions, sat inside, leaning toward one another in rapt conversation. Fortescue looked at the couple, then back to the Roma woman, not understanding. But she simply smiled and said, "Go to them, look more closely." And then she moved on from us to speak to the next guests entering the exhibit. So we approached, cutting our way through the distinguished crowd, until we stood at the wicker screens. The beautiful couple were only feet away from us, yet obscured by the screens and the darkness within their private enclosure. Both had fair skin, golden hair, and wore costumes of whites, browns, and golds. Hers a ball gown with petticoats, and for him a fine suit and hat. There was no glass between them and us, yet try as we might, we could hear nothing of their conversation. I tried to listen discreetly, while Fortescue stared boldly into their tableau, making no attempt to hide his interest. "My God, man," I whispered to him, "how unlike you to be so rude. At least try to disguise your curiosity." "But why?" he whispered back to me. "If what our host claims is true, these are not live people at all, but mere automatons acting out their routines." I glanced back into the private space. The young man had the most perfect profile I'd ever seen, one that belonged on stamps and coins. He took the slender white hand of the woman and pressed it gently against his lips. I felt myself blush, and I said, "Fortescue, please. Either we're intruding upon a private moment between lovers, or these are actors hired to pretend that they're automatons. I shall never believe that two such creatures are made of wires and cogs." I allowed myself a second longer look, this time at the lady. Her face was heavily powdered, no question, but her complexion was so beautiful, her cheeks so rosy, and as her companion whispered something unheard to her, She blushed. "Look for yourself," I said to my teacher. "That is no machine within." Yet Fortescue could not be dissuaded. He spoke to me again, as he often had, of the mechanical Turk. The smoothness of its movements, the confidence of its choices, and how lifelike it had seemed, despite being an obvious doll attached to a large box full of gears and rotors. But how might the art of the automata have advanced in the 70 years since the Turk's invention? Perhaps now the cogs and pulleys could be hidden within the natural proportions of the figures themselves, or, failing that, obscured by the furniture or the woman's flowing skirts. Even if the illusion was broken when the scene was viewed from another angle, so convincing was it from our vantage point that it was practically a miracle, if it was what it claimed to be. But as Fortescue's conviction grew, so did my impatience with the entire thing, for I was convinced it was a fraud. A man dressed in the robes and turban of the Orient approached us then. Like the woman who had greeted us, he was in heavy theatrical make-up, so much that I couldn't be sure if he was truly a dark-skinned person or not, nor could I guess his age. Perhaps he'd been listening to our conversation, for he understood our disagreement immediately. "I assure you, my friend," he said to me in a thick Indian accent, "your companion is correct. What you see here are two automatons. They are not actors. They are not live people. They are mechanical appliances. Allow yourself to believe. Allow yourself to be impressed. Have we charged you for the pleasure of seeing them? No. We merely wish to share our artistry with the enlightened men and women of the world." Fortescue immediately stepped forward to shake the man's hand and congratulate him and his company on their work. I, however, regarded our host more skeptically. We couldn't know that he was an inventor, any more than we could know that the figures were in fact mechanical. Finally, after some minutes, I tapped my teacher on the shoulder and told him I was returning to the hotel. I did not wish to rush him along when he was enjoying himself, but I was ready to retire. Fortescue looked disappointed, almost stricken. It was a look I had rarely seen from him, and which always made my heart sick when I did, for I knew it meant that I had disappointed him. He wanted so badly for me to share his excitement over this dream, yet I simply could not, too great was my skeptic's heart. So I left him there, returning to my bed, and I was soon asleep. Fortescue did not return that night, nor the next morning, nor any time that day. By evening I was terribly worried for him, and went to the police to report him missing. They listened to my tale and my description of my teacher, and I didn't doubt that they believed me, but the gendarmes seemed almost asleep while taking my report. Perhaps many people had gone missing during the fair. That was a troubling thought. But I was resolved to find my friend with or without their help. I went back to the little pavilion, but it was gone. In fact, there was no sign it had ever been there. I asked about it from the nearby exhibits, but the people there simply said that the exhibits packed up and changed often, and they had no way of knowing who came and went, and this was true. I stayed in Paris for another week, well beyond the date we were scheduled to return. I spent the days and nights prowling the avenues and alleys of the fair. I must have asked hundreds of people about my dear teacher Fortescue, but nobody saw anything, nobody recognized him, nobody remembered us. It felt like a nightmare. Yet I had to remind myself I might have passed any number of these people along the way, perhaps even multiple times during our time at the exhibition, and I didn't recognize a single one of them either. I returned home. Mother was outraged that not more had been done to locate our friend. She enlisted her uncles, among whom were men of some influence, to raise a stink amongst the police forces and even at the embassy. In the end, there was more effort put into the search for my teacher, but even after a year, no trace of him was found. At last we had to accept an awful truth, that something had befallen him the night that I left him to watch the supposed automatons. All along I had been racked with guilt for leaving him alone, doubly so because it had been out of annoyance. I couldn't remember, now, the last word he'd said to me, or the last look he'd given me. It was all a blur from the busyness of that day at the fair, and my haste to leave the strange pavilion for the quiet of my room. The shame of it was overwhelming. I tortured myself long hours over questions of his fate. Did he stop by one of the Dulcet exhibits on his way back that night and come to mischief? Was he robbed and murdered? Did he fall in the river and drown? I thought of it constantly, my poor Fortescue. A second full year went by. I accomplished nothing. I abandoned my studies without my tutor. Hiring a new one felt disloyal, even indecent. Mother understood, but was after me constantly to find some type of meaningful life's work. I avoided home as much as possible, taking just a coin or two with me, then riding my horse as far as I could before I finally had to turn and go back. The things that interested me were beyond my reach with my education incomplete, and I knew I had neither the temperament nor the dexterity for more manual work. Then, one night, as I rode up to our gate at sunset, I found a young woman waiting there for me. She had her scarf pulled up, worn like a hood, but she lowered it when she saw me coming, and what a beauty she was! Tall, though not tall as me, thin, blonde hair to the waist, dressed smartly in an emerald green walking dress that matched the color of her eyes. "Good evening, madam," I said to her. I gave her our family name, then said, "Have you the right house?" "I do, my lord," she said. She asked after the young master of the house, and the name she gave was my own. "But how do you know me?" I asked. "We have never met." "We have," she said, "though I'm not surprised you remember it not. I am Miranda Fortescue, the niece and only relation of your dear teacher, gone these 2 years. Miranda! Of course I remembered her. We'd met several times as children. She was a year or so younger than I was. We'd run through the gardens and played together, before there was any awkwardness in doing so. I remembered now her long blonde hair. It was harder to remember the face. Had I been asked, I never would have guessed she might grow up to be so beautiful. I offered her my horse and led her to the house. We went inside, not to the parlor, but to my private study. Once we were seated, I poured her a glass of wine, and then gave her my heartfelt condolences. Though they had been uncle and niece, Miranda and Fortescue, during their moments together, had seemed more like father and daughter to me. He did not speak of her often when she was away, because he never spoke much about any element of his life outside of our time together. But when there was news of her, like when she was coming to visit him again, he would tell me with such excitement. And I had always felt the excitement too. I never spent enough time with Miranda for her to become like a sister to me, but we were so alike, perhaps due to Fortescue's influence, that we became fast friends and rarely quarrelled. I thought of her often over the years. After my brief speech and my expressions of sorrow for her, and the confession of my feeling of guilt over Fortescue's disappearance, I asked her why she had come. I had a feeling it would be something to do with my old teacher, and indeed it was. But my heart leapt from my chest when she looked across the table from me and said, I have been following his trail for some time. I believe he is alive, nearby, and I know where he is. But I have not seen him since I was 16, when I went to live by the sea. Now I need your eyes to confirm it." She told me her story, but I barely heard. It didn't matter, as long as Fortescue was alive. It was nightfall by then, but I didn't care. I demanded she take me at once to where she thought he was. Hidden under cloaks and hoods, we travelled alone to the grimiest, most putrid parts of the city, to an area where desperation was a way of life, and every manner of vice and depravity was on display. I couldn't imagine what my dear teacher would be doing in such a place, or how this young lady had gone in there and emerged unscathed. But then again, I thought, I only presumed she was unscathed. Maybe, in time, I would learn that she was not. There was a place by the river that stank of filth, rotten vegetables, and dead fish and dead people. The gas lamps seemed fewer there, dimmer, perhaps an act of mercy, to hide the horrors from the eyes of people like me, or perhaps an unintended boon to whatever predators surely stalked those grounds. Then, silently, Miranda pointed to where several older, bedraggled men sat huddled around a small fire in a metal tub. Initially, I did not recognize any of them. They simply looked like unfortunate indigents, with long, scraggly beards, filthy faces, and wild eyes. But then one looked up at me, and while his expression was blank and uncomprehending, I recognized the face. For me there was no mistaking that aquiline nose, the high cheeks, the full brow. "Fortescue?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. Miranda was just behind me, clutching my arm. At the sound of the name, the old man spasmed as if he'd been shocked, his head rocking back, his eyes bulging. But then, as I watched, something approximate to his old character came over his face, that look of quiet knowing that I would recognize anywhere. "'Tis he, by God," Miranda whispered, her voice cracking. The old man took several steps toward me, then collapsed. I ran to him, weeping, while Miranda hailed a coach, and we took him home. Fortescue slept for 3 days, Miranda and I keeping a constant watch over him. Miranda shaved him, and beneath that beard was the face I knew and had missed so terribly. On the 3rd day he awakened, weak, but himself again. He said he could recall little of his ordeal. The last thing he remembered clearly was being at the Machinacea with me. He thought he'd been accosted on the way home from there, but he couldn't be certain. His memory of the last few years had vanished, he said, replaced by the memories of his old life, the moment he heard me say his name. I demanded that Fortescue return to life slowly. His home was gone, liquidated, once he was declared dead by the authorities. But I had seen to it that his most precious items were saved. He would now live with Mother and I on the estate. We had more than enough room. And I insisted that Miranda come as well, for he would need a nurse and family, and I had also come to see her as my companion, though I had not yet confessed this to her. Life went on. Mother was elderly, and she passed away, leaving the estate to me. Miranda and I became engaged, then married. No children came, but we were young, and there was plenty of time, so I did not worry much over it. Fortescue remained weak, and I did not press him to return to service as my teacher. But his wits returned, as did thankfully his old humour and his curiosity about the world. He did not go out often, and when he did he required assistance. but Miranda and I were happy to provide that. And the three of us, gradually, settled into a comfortable new life, quite different from the old, but none the less pleasing to me. I was happy. A decade passed. I was in the city one day on business for the estate when, while walking along the high street, I saw an advertisement for another great fair to highlight advancements in the technical arts. I told no one, but instead snuck out of the manor house one night and went to the fair alone. It was only speculation on my part, not even a hunch, yet I had to see. And sure enough, just off an alley, at the very back of the fairgrounds, was that small and familiar pavilion bearing the name Machinatia. I went inside, wondering if I would see the same Roma lady or Ottoman man. Instead, I was greeted by a Moorish-looking woman, much taller than myself, her neck made unnaturally long by heaps of golden loops piled around her throat. Yet her eyes seemed familiar to me, somehow. The space was full of cigar smoke and the excited chatter of many wealthy patrons, all dressed in finery, people from across Europe from what I could see. But one man approached me, a man in golden robes and wearing a red fez cap, smoking a long pipe. He looked like he could be the Sultan of Marrakesh himself. His costume was so authentic, but as before, I detected heavy stage makeup, and couldn't be sure if he was even a dark-skinned man. At once I asked him, "Sir, have we met before?" "Of course not," the man said, now in a heavy Barbary accent. "But I recognize a repeat customer. Come." I followed the Sultan into the back, through multiple portals draped with curtains and lined with golden ropes. Finally, we came to a dark, private room where a wicker screen led further inside. At the Sultan's invitation, I peeked through the screen, only to see my dear Fortescue inside, dressed more richly than I had ever seen him. It was undeniably him, yet he looked so young, so keen and fresh, with an open book in his lap and an uneaten apple at his side. He reclined on a Persian rug, and opposite him, sitting on a cot and also busy with her reading, was my darling Miranda, dressed in the fashion made popular by Empress Josephine, with her hair piled high atop her head, a tiara, and in a straight gown with a high waist. I looked at the Sultan, shocked and uncomprehending. "What is this?" I asked, knowing I had left them both at home in their beds. "Why are they here?" "You still do not recognize fine craftsmanship when you see it?" the Sultan asked. "Even after our demonstration so long ago? Even after living with two of our finest automatons for these past many years?" He shook his head as if unbelieving. "Your friend, the tutor, Fortescue. He impressed us greatly when we met him that night, so we insisted on making a replica of him. He was so flattered, he was honored, he said. A pity he did not live to see it realized." I still did not understand, but I took several steps toward the Sultan, intending to trap him between me and the wall. "What did you do to him?" I asked. "Oh, we did nothing to him," the Sultan said, batting me away with disgust. "Don't be absurd. We took impressions from him that night, and then he was on his way. What became of him afterward is known to us no more than it is to you. We offered to escort him, and he should have accepted the offer. That area of Paris is not always safe so late at night. Alas, he did not. As for the girl, clearly, she's not the real Miranda Fortescue. Presumably the real Miranda Fortescue is off living her life somewhere. But we felt badly for you, having lost your teacher and friend. We felt responsible, since it only happened because he stayed late with us. So we sent our first Fortescue model to you as recompense. And to further demonstrate our sincerity, we threw in the girl, too, complete with a custom-designed history to provide a satisfactory linkage. The Sultan smiled. So tell me, were you not pleased with your product? Surely you already knew, or at least suspected. If not, then why did you come here tonight? Then he chuckled and said, Ah, but of course. You two want a child, is that it? We can make children too, you know. I stared at the Sultan for a moment, dumbfounded. My body felt very cold. I looked at the replicas of my loved ones, enjoying their peace and quiet inside. Finally, I asked, Do they know what they are? The Sultan looked at them, taking a long drag from his pipe. Then, turning to me, he said, Define knowing. They are automatons. You recall the mechanical Turk from the last century, yes? It could play chess, though not through strategy or imagination as we think of it, but through the presence of weighted magnets automatically triggering certain moves on the board. An engineer might argue that the Turk did not know chess at all, and was merely responding to weight and pressure. But I suspect the chess masters that the Turk defeated would say otherwise. I fled from the pavilion then, from the fair, into the dark alleys of the midnight city, and I hid there all night, pacing, crying, thinking through the different possibilities of what I might do. I fled from everyone I saw, and as they passed me, be they man or woman, I wondered if they were flesh and blood, or just another automaton, an unfeeling doll, powered by what I could not say. Yet, as night became morning, I grew tired and cold. I grew hungry, and I grew lonely. I began to deny the reality of what I had seen and been told. Had I not always believed that the strange people behind Machinatia were hucksters? Had I not always insisted that their two young lovers' tableau was fakery? Surely they could have hired actors who resembled my wife and tutor as a means to torment me. Perhaps this was all some elaborate punishment for my refusal to take them seriously. Yes, surely this was all some cruel and elaborate plot, the punchline of which was simply beyond me. So I went home. The birds were singing, and the dogs were running in the yard. The staff were busy at their tasks, and my beloved Miranda and Fortescue were at the breakfast table, waiting for me. Is the young master a victim of a cruel trick, or the beneficiary of a great kindness? I guess that depends on whether you think love from the machine is possible. Personally, I don't know if it is or not, and it's hard to say how one might react in a situation like this one. But I have a feeling I might also go home and just try not to think too deeply on it. After all, the young master's loved ones are still the same people they were yesterday, whether he knew what they were or not. Until next time, don't forget me. N'est-ce pas?